Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Getting Ready for the Single Audit. I'm Kristen Biermeyer. I'm the Director of Marketing with Wegner CPAs, and I'm thrilled to have you all here today. Before we get started, just a couple of items to note. This webinar is being recorded, and I will be sending you a link to the recording along with the slide deck after the event. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you encounter any technical issues, please reach out via the chat or email to me and I'll assist you as best I can. Today, we are joined by two experts from our assurance team, April Campbell and Jolene Giese. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming April and Jolene to take the floor.
Hi, my name is April Campbell. I've been with Wegner about 12 years now. I'm a manager in the assurance department, and I focus mainly on single audits and nonprofits, and just really enjoy and have a passion for single audits and love helping clients through, complex situations and working through the audit every year. So that is my experience level, and I will hand over to Jolene to tell you hers.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Jolene Giese. I am a senior manager here at Wegner. I've been with Wegner for 10 years now, but have had prior experience at another firm before that for another numerous years. I specialize in not-for-profits and specifically in compliance, so single audits, uniform guidance, and really love this area. So if I start getting excited, that's one of the reasons.
We'll bring you into our agenda here.
All right. So overall for today, the agenda here is we are looking to make some improvements to help you guys get ready for a single audit. It starts well before the auditor arrives, so you want to be very proactive. Things that you can do, things that we're going to kind of look at today is improving your internal controls that support your audit success. Understand your common documentation gaps and how to close them. Demonstrate allowability, procurement, and time and effort. Those are typically some of the key ones that are looked at. And implement steps to improve audit readiness across teams. So we're going to try to give you some ideas of which things you can actually do, so actionable steps.
All right, so we're going to get started talking about understanding what is a single audit. So hopefully all of you know this, but if not, the single audit is required for non-federal entities that have over $1 million of federal awards, and that is the new threshold. So previous to year ends beginning on 10/1/24, it would have been $750,000 expended, but 1 million is the new threshold. So depending on your year, that will be the threshold for you. And the important thing is reminder that this is expenditures. And so, just because you have a federal award for $1 million in a single year, if you don't spend the $1 million, then you may not have a single audit requirement. So it's important to note that you definitely have to pay attention to what you're expending under federal awards, and prepare that schedule of expenditures of federal awards for your auditor to know whether or not it's required. And the big focus is compliance with federal requirements. And so we want to make sure that you have, are compliant with those, but also that you have controls over those federal requirements. And by federal requirements, I mean allowability, procurement, time and effort, and things like that. So, and during the single audit, we actually test both financial controls and compliance controls. And so we'll look at both, and we'll look at, we'll test your financial statement side of things. We'll, test your cash revenue, things like that. And then we'll go into the compliance side of things and test allowability with grant contracts and things like that. So there's a lot to a single audit. And so this is the reason we have the presentation, to get you all in a good good area to start your audit.
And just to note, this is a kind of a higher level presentation today, that if you do have in-depth questions or things that are very specific to your organization that you would like help with, we do offer consulting services as well. And so today's examples will be very much just generic and not specific to your organization. So keep that in mind as we go through these, that while there are some good examples, good things out there, you do want to make sure that you are tailoring your procedures, your details, what things you are documenting, how you're documenting to your organization. Okay. So key areas of risks in single audits. So things that we kind of see across the board. Number one is weak or undocumented internal controls. What does that mean? One, they're just not there. So you do have policies and procedures that may agree to, meet some uniform guidance requirements for the compliance side, but it does not get into your internal controls over those compliance areas. So it's very difficult, not only for when we ask, well, what controls do you have for this, for you to tell us, but it's also hard to test because they might not then be documented. So that is one area to start looking at is, do you have internal controls documented with detail in your policies and procedures? And when detailed, I always say who. So who is responsible? What are they doing? So what control are they doing? How and when are they doing it? How often? When are they doing it? And then key thing is, how are they going to document that control? Also, support for costs. So support for compliance requirements. So allowability typically are, hey, what kind of documentation are you maintaining for that? So that may look for like different things like an invoice, a purchase order, whatever that may be, and employees cost reimbursement support report, things like that, making sure that those are being maintained, filed properly, able to be provided. Procurement, we can go all day long on procurement. That could be a whole topic in and of itself, but there are many things that have to be considered under procurement due to different thresholds, different methods that are required by uniform guidance to be used. So making sure that your policies, procedures are very detailed to meet those different methods. So making sure that you can show the history of the procurement based on that, on those procedures. Another area, poor time and effort tracking. So actual time and effort is something that needs to be documented. It does not have to be in a time reporting system. It is recommended because it is something that does help with the process, but that there is very many different ways to document time and effort. It can be certifications, it can be through Excel, it could be a handwritten thing, as long as it's actual, timely, there's some review and controls over it, it would be something that could be acceptable.
And I do want to add, and we talked about the, having an invoice for costs. If an expense is not actually 100% allocated to the award, we really need to see not only the invoice, but support for that allocation. So sometimes that's a big risk area for us is that, you might have a lease expense and you have the lease to support the expense, but how much of that lease is being coded and what is your justification for that? So just keep that in mind when you're getting all of your support for expenses, that if it's, if it's not the whole invoice, then we will need to see something in addition to that. So designing strong internal controls is very important. It will reduce the risk of error, but also it can reduce any, fraud related risks and just non-compliance in general. So in designing strong internal controls, you really want to have segregation of duties. That's a big one. And this just means, the person approving the invoice cannot also be the person entering it into the accounting software. There's got to be some segregation there just to make sure that, things stay separate. And just for checks and balances as well. So if somebody's somebody's approving the invoice and somebody's entering it, or the same person, I should say, there might be an error, typo that's not caught. So having segregation of duties is really important. Authorization and approval processes. So this one is very important as well, especially on the compliance side. You want to have somebody in charge of approval of, expenditures and things like that, approval of allocations, approval of reporting, approval of procurement decisions. There's so many things that we need authorization and approval for on the compliance side of things. And this needs to be documented. So don't forget to, get that in a place of documentation. I have a lot of clients that use emails, and that's fine as long as you can obtain that email, and preferably you'd be saving that in a folder somewhere so that it's easily retrieved for the audit or for any monitoring that you have from your funder. And then ongoing monitoring. So there might be monitoring from your funding source, but also it's very important to have monitoring in your organization. So a lot of times we'll see larger organizations have someone that just does compliance monitoring. They might make sure that everybody's doing their job, and they might be called a grant manager. For example, smaller organizations, it might be the executive director, just making sure that, if employee A is supposed to be doing eligibility checks on participants, that they're, appropriately documenting those. Maybe every month you have a meeting and you walk through that, and then you document in the minutes, or perhaps there's checklists or monitoring schedules or something like that that you're doing. So keep that all in mind. And then embedding compliance into the day-to-day operations is really important too. So as long as you're working through this on a day-to-day, it shouldn't get missed. It's the stuff that just gets overlooked, that you'll all of a sudden realize, oh, hey, nobody did those eligibility, or nobody was monitoring, nobody was approving those procurement choices. So just embed that compliance into your day-to-day operations, and make sure that everybody's aware of those procedures.
Something to consider is the procedures of internal control. So someone's actually doing that. So they're making a determination of eligibility. They are determining that the cost is allowable. That's more the procedure. The control is someone else saying, yes, we agree that that was a good decision, or that has the support that's necessary. So that's kind of an example of the difference between being in compliant and having internal control over that. The other thing just wanted to mention is that there are examples that you can obtain to use to help generate ideas of what an internal control over compliance may look like for you. The OMB puts out annually a compliance supplement. The current year one that just came out is in draft form, but is out there. Part 6 walks you through what it is for internal controls over compliance, and then gives you various examples that you can start utilizing to then tailor specifically to your organization.
Yeah, I've definitely sent the matrix in the compliance supplement to clients before, because, say they got new equipment purchases, they've never dealt with equipment before. Hey, April, what's a good control that I can put in place for my equipment monitoring? And I will just send them that, or I will go out and just copy paste. So we use it a lot, Jolene and I, every day. And so it's definitely very helpful. It gets you the right ideas of what kind of controls would we be looking for as an audit firm, as the federal government. So definitely something to look out. And yes, it is 2,000 pages maybe, Jolene. And so I've had that question before too, like this massive PDF. And I said, yes, download, go to Google, type in OMB compliance supplement, get the most recent version, download that big PDF, and then use the search find feature.
Yep, part 6. Just start learning your parts. Use
Part
that
6
table,
is the appendix. Yep.
and then you'll be able to go right to that internal control section. So just high level, again, some just generic, general type of control examples here for time and effort. Very simple example here is there's timesheets, employees complete them, we sign off on it, and then their supervisor, internal control, would say, yes, this appears to be the actual time that this employee has worked on these activities. Timesheets should add up to 100% of actual time provided, so that way they can say, I worked on program A, B, other activities, and things like that. So sign-offs on timesheets is one example. Procurement. Now, I know a lot of our organizations probably don't procure at the formal methods of 250,000 above, but I'll quick give that example here is that at that level, right, you do need to have different procedures in place to ensure that you have the specifications that are needed for that award, that the proposals are bidding, that it's been advertised and solicited, to a wide audience, and then that when you receive them, that there's some technical evaluation of those. So the different requirements. So the review process, then it would be, well, what was required by uniform guidance? What does our procedures specifically state? And did we meet them? Did we come to a good conclusion? So that review process would be a sign off, maybe on a template that you have a checklist of here's all the information summary of information, and here's what our results were. And then you have a review and approval process on that. Another example here would be for travel. So for uniform guidance, it does say that travel costs must meet your policies and procedures of the organization. So therefore, if first class is not allowed and not acceptable for travel purposes, and you would want to make sure that that's, followed within your policy procedures, and someone's reviewing and approving to ensure that first class travel was not purchased and charged to the federal award.
I'll add one more example that we run into quite a bit actually is is the control on the invoice itself, or is it on like a more of a monthly basis? Like, is it a batch control or is it a transaction control? I guess is maybe a better way of saying it. So I definitely have clients that they approve timesheets, and the timesheet actually includes the time and effort documentation that we need, and that the organization needs to show compliance. But then I also have a lot of clients that they have timesheets and the supervisor reviews and approves, but that's not where the time and effort is documented, and or that's not where it's reviewed. So maybe it's reviewed on a monthly basis, more in a batch process. Where someone's looking at the batch of, that whole payroll at a time or that whole month at a time. And maybe they're using like an allocation percentage instead of, report. And so I have some clients that, our control is actually on the monthly allocation instead of the timesheet itself. So we do see it in both ways, and that works for invoices too. Sometimes the invoice is where the approval is noted that it's, appropriately charged to the federal grant, but sometimes it's actually on a monthly basis where someone goes through the transactions and says, yes, this one was approved, this one's approved, this one's approved, to be charged to the federal grant. And so it's just a matter of figuring out, where does it make sense to have that control take place? For some clients, it's transactional, and some clients, it's better to just do like more of batch, either monthly or semi-monthly with your payroll.
The key to designing and implementing internal controls is to try to make it as simple and easy as possible. If you can combine that control with maybe a financial control or other controls, and one sign off can mean multiple things where, yes, it's an actual expense of the organization. Yes, it's allowable. Yes, it meets cash management or time period of performance. It may be a sign off for multiple things. And that's why sometimes it could be a batch process, because maybe that's where you can do more other controls at the same time. It really is specific to the organization and what you do within your entity. So that's why we can give you the examples, but details, specific questions that are down to here's our situation. Those are things that we can consult on if you do have further questions, and kind of take a look at and give you some suggestions on what might be an easy way to add in a control or documentation of a control.
Yeah, and just to kind of circle that back, the biggest thing is making sure the control happens. So lack of controls is one of the largest things that we see in the single audit realm, is just that there is no control or there's no documentation of that control. So we want you to design controls so that they happen. If they're really cumbersome, then you might skip it, right? Or it's just going to get bogged down in the details. You're not going to do a thorough review. So try to make controls, design controls so that it's easy for everybody. It makes sense. The right people are doing the right job. And then I purposely put this slide up, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, because I cannot tell you how many times I've had people say, well, we met and discussed it. As the auditor, I can't say that happened. I can see your calendar invite on your, email Outlook, but I can't verify that it happened if there's not minutes, if there's not an email, stamps, a stamp of approval or a written signature is obviously the best. Systems are great. So just make sure that it's documented. And so that leads into this slide, which is basically, examples of documentations and some of the gaps that we see. And so common internal control gaps we've got listed here, lack of written policies and procedures. So if you don't have a good policy for procurement or allowability, time and effort tracking, you might not have a good control there either then. So make sure there's good policies. And in addition to policies, we want to see procedures. So a policy might say invoices have to be approved before being charged to the grant. But the procedure is, how is that getting done? So Does that look like a transactional approval? Does that look like a batch approval in some way, shape, or form? When is that being approved? So it's important to have written policies and procedures. There are some required by uniform guidance, but those are really important.
April, can I jump in quick?
Yeah.
So one thing I'd like to always kind of talk about with policies and procedures and what's the difference, because we tend to use them together or interchangeably, but there's technically a difference. Policies are more at your board level. They're organizational of high level, here's what we want to do. Procedures are more at the managerial level, more of the day-to-day activities and of more of the details of the who's going to do it, what are they doing, what are they using for information, when are they doing it, how often are they doing it, how is it documented. So think policies, high level, board approval type things. Procedures are more details. Management can, are doing that. Our management staff are kind of overseeing that. Those things can change on a regular basis as staff change, as circumstances change, that type of thing. So that's kind of where policies and procedures tend to have some differences. Is that you get the high level, low level, but we tend to utilize them as together when we speak of them because we use them interchangeably. So just note when uniform guidance, it actually says procedures more often than policies. They want to know that you have the details. So really think down to the level of who does what, when and how often, and then how is it documented, both not only for compliance, but internal controls as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a big one is, missing that evidence of review and approval. So again, if you don't have a procedure in place to say we are going to approve invoices before charging them, or sorry, that would be a policy, and then the procedure is, the executive director is going to review before it gets charged to the grant, and how that's documented, then you might have a missing review and approval documentation. Or so the evidence is very important. So it's, something that, like I said, emails work great, signing off on timesheets or invoices works great. We've got some clients that use like bill.com. And that's a good place for approval. So just make sure that there's some place that you're documenting that evidence of review and approval. Weak or incomplete segregation of duties, depending on how large your organization is, this might be a very hard thing to work through. But it's very important to segregate duties, again, so that the accountant is not the one of approving things to be charged to the federal grant. And if they are, then there better be another person in the accounting system that is entering those invoices into the software and running reports and things like that. There has to be some segregation of duties just to make sure that everything is, again, any errors are caught, any omissions, things like that. So, one thing that I've run into before with reporting specifically is invoicing your grantor. It's very important that somebody's preparing that invoice to be charged to the, to send to the grantor, and that somebody's reviewing that, because it's very possible that you could have something missing. There's a typo. Perhaps you're billing the wrong month. Perhaps you missed something that was supposed to be included. It's just very important to have that segregated.
That should be a slightly easier to comply with, because I think more and more with the updated uniform guidance that certification of your reporting is being more and more required. And so ideally, whoever's certifying that is the one reviewing and approving it, not also preparing it. So thinking about that could be a way to document that review and approval process, is that when they certify that, that signifies that they have reviewed and approved it. So again, segregation of duties is a key, though, that the preparer is not the same person.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be also a help going forward, is that more and more of those. And when we say reporting, it's also your cost reimbursement requests. Those are reports as well, and they must be complete and accurate. Or as that certification is now saying, you may be subject to the False Claims Act. So they are being very serious about all submissions that they receive.
And then, so I'll talk a little bit about compliance gaps that we see, missing or incomplete timesheets. So, this might be again, time and effort. So it might be a timesheet, but it might also be, okay, great, they worked 40 hours. Now, how much of that 40 hours was related to the grant that are in question? So missing or incomplete timesheets is a huge one for us that we've seen many times. A lot of times it'll be a salaried employee, which is fine. They don't have to have a timesheet, but then please, please, please have them document in some way, shape, or form how they're spending their time on that grant. Because if they don't have a timesheet to tell us, then we really aren't sure why you're charging 50% of their salary to the grant, and whether or not
Also,
that's reasonable.
when you have a salaried employee, 80 hours is a budget number, not an actual number. So they still need to be somewhat tracking their actual hours because that impacts the allocation to different awards. So just note that's more of a budget number and actual. So if they work 79 hours, yes, they're getting paid the 80, but 79 hours is what's the allocation is going to be based off. Or if they worked 100 hours that time period. So it does impact. And so that has to be considered when you're looking at time and effort, the actual hours are being tracked.
Yeah, so then that kind of, so lack of source documentation. So that could be an invoice, that could be a contract approval, that could be, for eligibility, maybe you're determining eligibility, but there's no documentation of, the person's poverty level, for example, or the fact that they're homeless, for example. So lack of support of source documentation is something that we see quite a bit, and just make sure that when you're charging things to the federal grant, that you're really keeping all of that source documentation in an orderly manner, so that you can pull that out for either us, the auditors, or your monitoring visit, perhaps.
April, can I jump in with another time and effort? Because we talked a lot about
Yeah.
hour tracking. However, another option would be on the percent tracking. So sometimes the certifications are done just by percentages. That kind of takes away, like when you do have a lot of salaried individuals to say, out of my 100% of hours I worked on this 10%, 15%, and add up to the 100%. That can help get away from the actual hours worked by doing on the percent basis. So there is multiple ways to look at it, again, based on internal and procedures and documentation.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that it cannot be based on budget. So that's something we see quite often. Like, someone will say, well, so and so was in the budget for 50% of their time going to this grant, and if somebody left in the organization and they were taking over responsibilities for another staff person, and they're no longer spending 50% of their time in that grant, then they can't be charged 50% of their time. So it's just very important to kind of do a look back analysis, and perhaps, have a process in place to make sure that, they're certifying, yes, I did spend 50% of my time this month or this pay period or whatever it is, and keep that documentation as well. Incomplete procurement records, again, that's a massive one we see all the time. So not only do you have to do procurement, make sure you're, getting contracts approved, and, comparing bids from other places, making sure you're keeping, you know, businesses that are underserved in mind. Like, there's all these things that you have to do for procurement, but keeping that in some form of record is something that a lot of our clients struggle with. And so you can, have a checklist. You can have, I guess a checklist is, in my opinion, the best way, just to make sure that you're documenting procurement. And, yes, we did make sure that this person was not suspended or debarred. Yes, we've made sure that we kept free and open competition. Yes, we made sure that we were, had no conflicts of interest, things like that. So incomplete procurement records is something that we see quite a bit. And we do recommend that you tighten up things in that area, specifically if you're doing a lot of procuring or getting goods and services over $10,000.
And she just mentioned that threshold. However, it is still at the micro purchase as well. So that one is the one that's looked over quite frequently, is that there is documentation requirements at that micro purchase threshold level. I'll jump into that a little bit later.
Yeah, procurement, like she mentioned earlier, is like a whole can of worms. So we personally, we don't love procurement either, but it is something to spend some time on if it applies. So, and it almost always applies, unfortunately. So, But inconsistent cost allocation support. So again, this is, if you're allocating costs on a monthly basis, perhaps, and you don't have like a good way of tracking that or supporting your allocations, that's important. Also, just knowing that you should have a cost allocation plan, and that should document that, we're allocating office based on square footage, or FTE perhaps, or we're using the salary, however salaries are allocated, that percentage is what we're using for office. Whatever that is, it should be documented, and then it should flow through. So we'll be testing, the cost allocation to make sure that it's appropriate with what is documented. And subrecipient monitoring, that's another one that we see a lot of documentation gaps. So, if you have subrecipients, make sure that you are doing the monitoring of them. You're asking for their audit. You're asking, reviewing their invoices that they're submitting to you, that you're making sure they're complying with the federal requirements. But not only doing that, you need to make sure that you're documenting those things as well. So maybe have a checklist, or maybe, like I said, maintain the invoices that they're sending to you, and have some way to document that review of what they're sending and your monitoring of them. So.
Yeah, one of the things with procurement and subrecipient monitoring is that they basically have multiple requirements under each of the overall compliance requirement. And that's what makes it more tricky. And it also comes down to, what does your organization do specifically to make sure you're in compliance? It all comes down to the details. So one thing to consider for that is, do you have a good system of documentation of what's the determination? Are they a contractor or are they a subrecipient? That's step number one, is that you should have some type of policies and procedures on determination and controls over that. Then once it's determined whether they're a contractor or subrecipient, making sure to apply the correct compliance requirements related to that area. And as April was mentioning for subrecipient monitoring, right, you do have a few things. I like to break it down into three big categories. One, you're providing the required information to your subrecipients. Two, performing risk assessments and documentation of that. And then three, monitoring based off of that risk assessment. What do you need to do for that, and based on that risk assessment, and what procedures, and then are you following and doing those procedures, which includes follow-up of any audit or other findings and things like that.
Yeah, those are two very robust areas for sure.
Okay, so then how do we close those gaps? How do we document, improve our documentation? One, you do need to look at your policies and procedures regularly. When I see, we always have to ask, we need to see your policies and procedures because we need to know if anything changed or, things. And I tend to see a lot of policies and procedures that are dated 4, 5, 6 years ago. And I'm going, oh, I'm going to guess things change. I'm going to guess, from guidance periodically changes and updates. Was it addressed? Maybe, maybe not. And so again, being specific, you want to make sure you review and update regularly. Set calendar update tasks, do it once a year, set something to say, let's at least read through that. Anytime there's changes in personnel, changes in how you're doing things, update those procedures. Another one April mentioned too, and we absolutely recommend, create your own templates and checklists. What specifically to your organization do you need to document? What things do you need to review? Who's doing it when, how? Have some checklists so it's not forgotten. Things change frequently. Sometimes it's busy, sometimes it's not. So when it's not busy, maybe you don't forget. But when things get busy, maybe you're like, oh, I only reviewed for this, but I forgot to look at that. And now we have an issue with compliance. So having templates and checklists help ensure that you are meeting compliance requirements. Take a look at their files, right? So how are you maintaining and storing the documentation? I have an example where a client's like, oh yeah, we always obtain this and we store it here. I'm like, well, can you go back to this month and show me that you've done that? Go and look, and the file is blank. There's just nothing there. And they're like, oh, but we usually do this. It fell through on for that time period. I don't know why it is, but us auditors tend to pick the month or the period that was always forgotten. We just have a knack for it. So go back, do some regular file checks, make sure that the support did actually make it to where it's supposed to go, so that when it's requested, you can easily say, here it is. And then training. So especially if you're updating and looking at procedures, make sure that you train the staff that are going to be doing those procedures that, hey, this is what you're actually doing. This is why we need you to sign off on this, or here's where we need this documentation, because of this shows we've done the compliance. This shows you've done the internal control documentation. So really meeting with your staff, having them understand the importance of those areas.
Yeah, and I'm just going to add a couple things in here as well. So I really recommend using software. So I have a lot of clients that have software that will help them document eligibility, for example. So I work with some low-income housing tenant clients. And so they have like tenant software, and they, enter in the income, and they enter in the family size and all of that. And it kind of automatically calculates the poverty level. And then you enter, you basically set the matrix on the back end to say, this is the poverty level that makes them eligible to be, a tenant of ours under this program. And it'll spit that out. And then there's your documentation of the determination of eligibility. And then you just have to make sure there's an approval. And a lot of those systems will have that as well. So then once say the counselor determines eligibility, then they pass the file off, and then the supervisor reviews that and make sure, yep, I don't see any errors, the calculation looks right, the support's there, everything matches, boom, approved. And a lot of times that software will document that as well. So that makes it really easy. And then you can screenshot that for the auditors. You can print it. You can let us have access to the, maybe read-only access to the software. And it works really great. Other things I've seen is for allowability, like bill.com. I've seen that a lot. Otherwise, like other systems like Abilla. I'm trying to think of like MIP, things like that. So and then Google Sheets is something I've also seen. So I've got some clients that use Google Sheets. So they'll do their allocations in Google Sheets. And then there's a way, don't ask me how, there is a way to like document approval on the side, and it'll give you like a date stamp and things like that. And then I'm pretty sure it will alert you if there's changes after that approval is made, because there's like almost like a audit trail that you can pull down. So things like that, use technology to your advantage. You can use AI to generate a checklist. Hey, give me a procurement checklist, give me a subrecipient monitoring checklist. Use your tools. Don't, work smarter, not harder. It's just a matter of getting things pen to paper and just getting it done, instead of like, working hard to get something perfect. Just get it documented and use what you can to leverage that.
Yeah, and using AI, that is going to be your starting point. You do still have to tailor it. You do have to read it. You have to still make it make sense to you. So don't just sign off on stuff and then you're like, well, we don't actually do that, or we don't even use that term, or whatever it may be, or it doesn't make sense for your organization. Use it as a starting point to tailor the information to what you guys do. The other thing I just wanted to quick mention on that is retention policies and procedures, that if you are utilizing softwares or cloud to host and save your support, consider the time frame. I've had a few clients that there was a change in the service, and instead of, it's going to be available for 7+ years, it dropped down to 3 years or 1 year, and they started losing data. So then as you come in for the audit, all of a sudden go, hey, show us this, and they're no longer able to provide that data, it's gone. So always check to make sure that whatever software, cloud service, documentation that you have is being maintained for the correct retention period.
Yeah, it's a good point. So let's talk about allowability specifically, since this is something we test, I would say arguably on every single audit that we do. Every major program pretty much asks us to test allowability. And so the biggest thing is, you have to align activities with costs with federal program purpose. So just making sure that the costs that are charged to the grant are allowable under that grant. So, I'd love to give examples of things. And so I had a client that had a PPE grant during COVID, and I found office supplies. And I said, well, what the heck is this? And they said, oh, well, I missed that. And so it's just making sure that that type of stuff doesn't happen. So make sure that your costs that are charged are allowable. And that's in that case, there was no review. And so they actually had a finding over review for that because there was no review. She just said, oh, I thought that so and so did their list correctly. And she never reviewed it. She just trusted. And as an auditor, we always say trust but verify. And so you definitely want to, make sure there's a review process there and make sure that all the costs that are charged to the award are allowable. Because as an auditor, we'll come in, we'll take a sample, and we're going to look and make sure that the costs charged are. And so make sure you're maintaining your support, invoices, including cost allocation, and then approvals as well. So we'll not only test the compliance side, which is the invoice, but we will test the approval as well. So a lot of times my clients will upload both as separate, but sometimes it is together. So sometimes they will sign the invoice as approved. And it's just making sure that the approval is not saying that, this is an eligible expense for the business, but it's saying that it's an eligible expense to be coded to the grant. So just make sure that the control is designed appropriately to do that. And then definitely reference uniform guidance. So the CFR, which I believe there's a link somewhere in this presentation, maybe not, but you can definitely go to Google and type in to CFR, and you'll be able to go to the regulations and see, what's required of your organization. But then also the compliance supplement is a great tool just to read up on allowability and what that means.
All right, here's this fun procurement area. Again, this could be practically a full day of worth of information, but we're going to just go very simple here. You do have to document your compliance with procurement and internal controls over that. So the key here is uniform guidance does require procedures over your procurement methods. And they require this because there are 3 methods that you must follow depending on the thresholds that are set. So the federal thresholds is under 10,000 is the micro purchase. Between that and 250,000 is the simplified acquisition method. And then over 250,000 is your formal methods. And then based on those methods, that's where uniform guidance says, now I need you to develop and determine what specifically you're going to do within those methods to be compliant. So for example, the one area that I find most clients really struggle with documentation is the micro purchase, the $10,000 threshold and under. Per uniform guidance, this is actually what it says. Micro purchases may be awarded without soliciting competitive price or rate quotations if the recipient or subrecipient considers the price reasonable based on research, experience, purchase history, or other information, and maintains documents to support its conclusion. So a lot of times the client, when we say, well, show us your support for this, we have invoices. Now, the question then is, does an invoice adequately tell me that some research, some experience, some purchase history, or other information was used? Maybe, maybe not. And that's going to come back to, well, what's in your policies and procedures? What does your procedure say that's being done? And what kind of support at the end of the day is going to be required? And so that's where a lot of times I'm asking my clients, what can you do? What can be simply done? Again, we don't want to make this more difficult, but what can you show to say that all this was performed and done to compliance requirements? So that's one area that I do see a little bit of some disconnect between procedures and written procedures and what's being provided as support. The small acquisition threshold, typically it says, hey, you need to have at least, what's a reasonable number of quotes or rates documented. So your policies and procedures need to be specific and say, we want a minimum number of price or rate quotations. And auditors must audit to your procedures. So if you say we need a minimum of 3, we have to see a minimum 3. If it's 2, it's technically a deviation. So your procedures are very much key to how we need to audit, especially in procurement. And then the same thing for the competitive proposals of formal methods, right? How many do you need to have for and where do you solicit? How do you do that? How are you going to evaluate? Do you have a committee? Do you have individuals? What's that going to be based on? What requirements are being put into contracts? So I think, some of these procedures, some of these written procedures can be like 30 pages in length, depending on all the necessary things that you have going on. So just something to consider there is that procurement is very detailed and we have to audit to your procedures. The better your detail, the better your procedures are in writing, the easier it is for not only for you to comply, train, do things internally to be compliant, but it's then very easy for the auditors to come in and say, hey, we see that your procedures say, this and this is what your document, please provide that. You can then easily provide that and we can test it, see the internal control, see the compliance, and we are good. So those are some of the things that you do have to consider. Another thing in this is suspension debarment. So sometimes this is what's being missed as well, is that typically 25,000 and more of transactions do need to be checked to see if they are suspended and debarred from contracting with the United States government. So we do have a link on this slide that kind of gives you a YouTube of, well, how do you even do that? How do we look at sam.gov to even find that? And so, in your procedures, you want to say, here's our procedures, how we do this, when we do it, and here's our support. We're going to screenshot our results to prove that we did it and that they're not suspended and debarred. We might say it's part of our contracts that we have them self-certify. What are you doing to ensure that you have what you need for that suspension debarment compliance requirement? So hopefully that gives you a few ideas on documentation of your procedures. Really comes down to what type of level that you are procuring at, what level of detail that you are putting in your procedures. That's where we're going to audit to. So that's why I say go out, read some of that a little bit. They are very clear within uniform guidance that say we want this, and then they can then leave it up to you on how you're going to do that.
Yeah, and I just want to add a small tidbit because I've had personally a couple issues with non-competitive procurements. And so what that just means is that there's either a small supply. In one case, it was like during COVID, and there was only like one contractor that could literally do the task that they needed done to get this dental office back and running. And so, when there's non-competitive procurement, the best thing to do is to either get it approved by your federal ward agency like ahead of time. So maybe just send them an email or a request somehow, get them to approve that non-competitive procurement. Or the other thing would be to just document the fact that it's non-competitive procurement, and this is why. And there's, let's see, 5 scenarios in which it's okay to do that. And one of them is just that it can only be fulfilled by a single source. So you would just have to write a memo, from the organization, just write a memo, we, the organization, have looked, and this is the only source that we can get this piece of equipment from, for example, and then sign it. And certain.
You do want to have your search history. You want to have your support as backup though. So again, procedures are key.
Yeah.
You do want to have procedures over this of what do we expect to have? What things do we need to show as backup that you actually went out and looked and said there was nothing else? Or we found that this is slightly similar, but it doesn't meet the requirements because of X, Y, and Z. So being very specific in your memo, your documentation, and then your support showing that you did that work, showing that, that you have that history of searching.
And I just want to note that you have to have documentation of that control, that someone reviewed and approved that decision, because that's where, a couple of my clients got in trouble was, yes, they, it was appropriate that they did not competitive procurement, but there was no regard to, someone approving that decision. They just did it behind the scenes and then went ahead with things, and never said yes, we're approving this non-competitive procurement. In specificity, I can't say that word, and so just make sure that you're documenting that specifically so that when we come out and look at things that we're not dinging you for it. So,
and please note, a line item in your budget is not a pre-approval to not do a procurement method.
Correct.
It is not a sole
Yes.
source. It is an actual request to your funder saying, I would like to not use we want to use the non-competitive method for this entity. Here's why. And they actually write back in writing saying, we approve that you do a sole source method.
Yep. definitely not being, just being in the budget is not approval because the budget is not saying who you're contracting with. So, and even
Even if
so,
it
if you
is
do have a
detailed out.
vendor, well, I was gonna say, even if you do have a vendor in your contract, it's not saying that that doesn't, the federal agency doesn't know that you didn't procure for that vendor. And so just because you have an approved vendor doesn't mean that that's approved as a sole source either. So just, yeah, be very careful with non-competitive procurement. Um, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend too much time here on time and effort just because we've kind of talked about it quite a bit, but definitely there's options to documenting time and effort. It's definitely an issue area for us that we see, just poor documentation of time and effort, inconsistent, things like that. So, you can do personal activity reports. That would be a timesheet. That might be, an email saying for the last month I worked on XYZ. Kind of depends on the organization what that looks like. It could be certifications. So we'll see, kind of more of a formal like PDF or something saying I certify that I worked 100% under this federal program for this period of time. Things like that. Those are a couple options, but at the end of the day, the biggest key takeaway for time and effort is that it has to be actual work performed. And so that's the biggest thing is we have a lot of clients that want to just use budget or they'll just use, well, for last month they use 50%, so we're going to use 50% for this month. And it's like, no, we have to make sure that that 50% is appropriate for each month going forward and reflects actual work because things change. We all know that. Our jobs don't look the same typically, day to day, month to month. So just making sure that you're keeping that in mind. And yeah, so that's what I want to say on that one.
Okay. So overall, things that you can do to kind of get ready. Make sure you have someone responsible. Okay, kind of like same thing with internal controls procedures, like the procedures of who is doing it. So same thing here. Actually having someone lead the organization of this, kind of have some checks and balances, maybe delegate some of the stuff of I need, check these files for this type of detail. Maybe I need to have someone else review policies and procedures and see which ones we need to update. So just have someone leading, someone to do it, whether they're doing it all, whether they're getting able to delegate, but have someone actually assigned to do this process. Have someplace that the documentation is easy to access and that you can maintain, find it. Because unfortunately, we do have to ask for a lot of support. Sample sizes tend to be on a larger size because we have to give that opinion at the major program levels. So the sample sizes are quite large in some instances. So you want to make sure that the data, the information is easy to grab, easy to provide. So that way it's not taking too much time of your time to kind of compile that at the end. Again, checklists, use something to help out through this process of, here's what we're going to do to monitor. Here's what we're going to do to get prepped throughout the year when we're going to do it. Find some checklists, find some ways to make sure that nothing's falling through the gaps throughout that process. And then communicate expectations. So communication is always key. So if you are delegating, if you're assigning different tasks to different people, maybe program leaders need to do some of the work versus accounting, or, communication, set up some meetings, set up time, set up some follow-ups, really is great because it helps in understanding what's needed. And also understanding maybe where there are some gaps that you can then train, maybe do some retroactive type fixes. So that way, maybe you identify, whoa, we didn't review this. Well, instead of going back to every single transaction, maybe at that point in time, you're saying, well, right now we're going to do a sample or we're going to do some batch type things, but going forward, this is our process. So being able to communicate, have someone lead it is key.
Yeah, start small and just build up and get better and better each year. You know, don't take findings to heart. It's just a learning experience, and just typically we don't a lot of times see those 2-year findings. And if we do, it's just because the audit's being done midway through the year. So then obviously by the time the finding comes out, the change happens. Sometimes there is a 2-year, but typically speaking, findings usually turn the organization into more of a well-rounded thing. So. And definitely some resources that you're going to want to look at to keep you in compliance and give you those internal control examples that we mentioned was, federal guidance, and that comes from uniform guidance, which is that CFR that we were discussing, and the compliance supplement. Both of those can be found through Google. I have a couple favorites, but also very much Google to get to those spots if I need them. And then sam.gov is something we didn't add, but that's also a good resource. And then training materials from pass-through entities. So a lot of times you'll get like a program manual with your grant award or a link to their website. And there's a lot of great resources there. And then internal expertise, peer networks, and Wagner Compliance Consulting. So Jillian and I do work with non-audit clients, I should say, to help with draft policies and procedures. I have helped do a procurement checklist for clients. We've helped do monitoring checklists for clients and just kind of, get it tailored to your organization. We can give you a template. You can tell us what you need, and we can work through to kind of get you where you need to be and hopefully help your compliance and help your audit process go a little more smooth. So.
All right, so final tips here before we kind of close out or maybe go to questions here is don't wait to the audit to prepare. That's typically the number one finding, things that happens is all of a sudden you ask for things, you're like, I don't know. And then you have to spend time trying to find something or get something and you're like, oh, wait, that's not how we do it. We have to ask for more information. So prepare year round, right? Set up some tasks of monitoring, set up review of internal controls, do some things pre-audit, do it year round, and then keep open communication, making sure that you are, new awards come in, new funding sources, reach out, ask, hey, we got a new funding source, just wanted to let you guys know. Do you have any concerns, any risks that come up, how, anything that we should be aware of that that you might want to say, wait, we might not need to consider changing something or adding in, or maybe now we need to prepare a schedule of expenditures of federal awards. Maybe you're like, I don't even know how to do that. What's some methods to do that? So that's some of the things that we do consult on as well, to help you kind of monitor and track throughout the year that financial management piece of federal award expenditures. So keep open communication, reach out to your auditors, reach out to your consultants. Like April had mentioned on the previous slide, you can even reach out to your funders. It is a subrecipient monitoring process. You are, it's in there saying you're supposed to be providing training and other information to your subrecipients. So your funders, if you're a subrecipient, they are to be providing that to you as well. So reach out to them. If it's not clear whether you're a contractor or subrecipient relationship, reach out, ask them, hey, I'm not sure, this contract, the information here wasn't as clear to me. Help me out. What do you guys need for this? What kind of support? Here's what we're doing. Is this going to work? You can always reach out to your funder as well.
Yeah, so hopefully, everyone's taken a little piece of something that they've learned today, and hopefully you can make some small changes and, make some great changes on your audit, make things just go a little bit smoother. I would say we have time for questions, but I'm not sure we can answer any in a minute. So I'm not sure, Kristen, if you have any feedback on that, if there were any questions in the chat that we should address, but.
Yeah, if you have a couple minutes to stay on, we just had 2 questions come in. Sure. If you'd like to take a look at them. The first one is, my segregation of duties is embedded in each process. Do you have an example of a segregation of duties, procedure, or policy that is all encompassing?
I guess I'm a little bit confused by the question, but I think as long as there's 2 people involved in every process, then you should be fine. I think the question seems like maybe it's happening and you don't have the policy or procedure. Is that maybe what you're thinking, Jillian, too, or?
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, there's not just going to be an overriding, like maybe you have a policy, like high level, that we're, organization wide, we want segregation of duties. But then at each specific area, so if you're talking about financial side of like cash receipts, well, you're going to have that built into that cash receipt process of here's who's doing it, and here's what we're doing to, for that control. We're reviewing and approving by this. So it's kind of worked into each area. Same thing then for compliance. You're talking about allowability. where you're saying, well, here's who's doing the initial allowability assessment, and then here's our review and approval of that. So it's going to be, like you said, embedded in each process, because you have the process and the control at each area. But overall encompassing, it's more just going to be a policy, because it's going to be hard to kind of have one area where you're going to list out every single thing without kind of talking about more of that detail of every area. So hopefully that makes more sense.
Great, thank you. The next question is, can you please share how one does a risk assessment?
Well, it does vary, but I can just give a
Good.
kind of general idea of, so in uniform guidance, they say, hey, you need to perform some type of risk assessment. The key is they do provide some guidance in there on some characteristics that you need to consider. So that's the starting point. Grab those characteristics, those little starting points, to put into your template matrix of whatever you want to start with, and build from there. So you're going to start with that. And then you're going to go in and say, well, what do we have to comply with, right? So what compliance requirements are we passing through to them that we have to be concerned about in monitoring? Then you might have questions related to that, or requests. Please provide your procurement policies and procedures. We want to see them. You might say, have you had federal, I think one of the required ones is, how have you dealt with federal awards previously? What's your experience level? Things like that you want to kind of Q&A, make sure you request a few things to kind of get an idea of what their internal controls look like. Do they have any? Have they had experience? It's going to be kind of tailored. Nobody looks exactly the same. And then, but in your procedures, when you're kind of building that out of what your risk assessment is going to look like, you also then want to say, well, what does it mean? How do we rate that? So at the end of the day, do we have a number system? Do we have, if we say yes or no to certain things, does that make it high, moderate? Do you just have a low, moderate? Like what levels are you going to assess them at? Because low risk, if it's low risk, possibly all you need to do is what's required by uniform guidance. That might be what you put in your policies and procedures, is we're going to make sure we review invoices, things like that, and audits, and follow up that way. If it's moderate, now you're going, well, what's the next step? If it's moderate risk, what does it indicate? Where do we have to look? Do we need to ask for more support? Do we have to seed some time and efforts periodically? Do we need to do a site visit? And then if it's high risk, right now you're adding on even more. Now we might need to do site visits quarterly. We might need to ask for support for everything with their invoices. Again, these are just examples and not a must. Uniform guidance sets the baseline, and then you kind of build from there, and it's based on your procedures on how do you monitor your subrecipients to make sure that they are meeting the compliance requirements that you pass through to them.
Thank you. That's all the open questions we had for now. But of course, if you think of any that come up after this event, or you have follow-up questions for Jolene or April, their contact information is in the slide deck. Again, I'll be emailing that to you after the event today. So feel free to reach out if you have additional questions or would like more support for your organization. A huge thank you to Jolene and April for an amazing presentation today. We certainly appreciate you sharing your expertise. There was so much great information in here. Thank you so much for your time. And we appreciate everybody that took the time out of their day to come attend the webinar today. Be sure to check out other upcoming webinars and resources that we have available on our website. And if you aren't already, make sure you're signed up for our email list so you stay up to date on future events and resources. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.